Welcome to Lauren's House COVID Mental Wellness Check-In. I'm Monique Graves, and today we will be discussing trauma and stress. Today's presenter is none other than Oakland-born and raised native Alexis Owens. Alexis was raised in the community of West Oakland by her great-grandmother. Alexis learned valuable lessons at an early age, such as the benefits and the power of faith, love, and education. Alexis is a registered associate marriage and family therapist with over 4 years of serving diverse populations in private, group, and community organization settings. Her desire is to provide all clients with a person-centered approach to which demonstrates empathy, genuineness, and acceptance is a top priority. Miss Alexis has a professional history of working with the Contra Costa County Child Protective Services, where she has the privilege to collaborate with families as they navigate the court process of juvenile dependency cases. Ms. Owens has also been a lead care navigator for the Alameda County Care Alliance Collaborative in Oakland, California since 2015. Ms. Owens attributes her ability to serve and grow in any capacity as a blessing and honor from God, as she strives to keep him at the center of it all. Without further ado, the next voice you will hear will be that of Alexis Owens. See you at the end. Remember, if you have any questions, comments, please leave them in the chat, or you can send us a text message and we will get through to your message throughout the presentation. Thank you so much, and we look forward to seeing you at the end.
Excerpt of the DSM5 definition. And just for anyone who may not know, the DSM is just an acronym for the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. So it's a book filled with mental disorders from A to Z. So the DSM-5 defines it as trauma requires an actual or a threatened death, a serious injury, or sexual violence. So different experiences that may be traumatic can be physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. And I know we all have heard of it. We've seen the impact on various individuals and probably even ourselves. We know that these things can be very traumatic. Also, childhood neglect, a child not being able to receive just basic necessities or have their needs met. Childhood neglect can be very traumatic for children. Also, another example is living with a family member with mental health or substance use disorders. That can be very traumatic for some people. Just looking at the impairment of functioning for their loved one based on their substance use disorder or based on their mental health disorder. So really, the difference between stress and trauma is just really lifting up that it's a serious injury, often including sexual violence, but it's also an actual death or threatened death. So in other terms, a near-death experience. And it's all about perception, because what may be traumatic to me may not be traumatic to you all. So it's all about our individual experiences. And just a quote at the bottom, it says, stress becomes trauma when the intensity of frightening events becomes unmanageable to the point of threatening physical and psychological integrity. So real quickly, we have here categories of stress and trauma that are important just to know. We're not going to get into various stress and trauma, but I at least wanted to lift up the categories that fall under each. So for stress, you have positive stress, and you may be thinking, well, what's positive about any type of stress? And positive stress just basically states that developmentally and intellectually appropriate levels of stress can actually be growth producing. It's also known as productive stress that happens to be accompanied by a challenge. So as an example, we may get into a stressful situation, but after it's over and done with, we found that it actually helped us. Maybe we gained a new skill. Maybe we gained patience. but there's some type of growth producing effect because of that particular stress that occurred in our lives. So that's why they call it positive stress. Then you have tolerable stress. And this refers to stress responses that could affect the brain architecture, but generally it occurs for briefer periods of time. But with the appropriate social supports that allows our brain to recover from that stressful event, it can actually or potentially reverse the harmful effects. So this is to say we've experienced a stressful event, but perhaps social supports came around us that helped us to reverse the initial effects that actually happened because of the stressor. And lastly, you have toxic stress. A lot of times our mind goes to this particular category of stress, toxic. It refers to strong, frequent, or prolonged activation of the body's stress management system. So this is talking about stress that just continues to happen. You just continue to experience this particular stressor over time that activates our body's stress management system. So that is known as toxic stress. Let's look at the different categories of trauma. So you have acute trauma, chronic trauma, and complex trauma. So acute trauma, literally to remember it, just think a single distressing event. So it's really lifting up that it's one event, and it can be anything like an accident, a rape, any type of assault or natural disaster. But the event is extreme enough to threaten the person's emotional or physical security. So a single event that has a strong enough impact that threatens the person's emotional or physical security. Chronic trauma. So this is where an individual is exposed to multiple long-term and or prolonged distressing traumatic events over an extended period of time. So as an example, where maybe a child began to experience sexual abuse at a very early age, perhaps 4 or 5 years old, but it continues to happen. So there was no intervention. The sexual abuse continued on into the adolescent years. So that would be an example of being exposed to multiple long-term or prolonged distressing traumatic events. And then lastly, complex trauma. Now, this is a little different. Complex trauma suggests that we are exposed to varied and multiple traumatic events or experiences. The events are generally within the context of an interpersonal relationship, such as domestic violence. So when you talk about exposed to varied or multiple traumatic events, that's saying it's layers of trauma. Layers of trauma. So different types of a trauma. So say for instance, it was emotional abuse. So severe distressing experiences where somebody is just emotionally abusing you, talking down on you, condescending, putting you down. And then there's another layer of sexual abuse that is happening as well. And then there may be domestic violence that's happening within the relationship as well. So that's an example of being exposed to varied layers of trauma and it happening multiple times. All righty. So now that we've got down the basic foundation of what stress is, what trauma is, I wanted us to really look at how trauma manifests. So we hear a lot about trauma, but oftentimes we don't know what it looks like, especially if you haven't been studying it or you haven't experienced it. And so during this time, we really want to raise awareness for ourselves, but we never know who we may need to share this information with as well. So when it comes to symptoms of trauma, we're going to have emotional and psychological symptoms. We also will have physical symptoms. So let's take a look at the emotional and psychological symptoms. This can be shock, denial, or disbelief. It can also be anger, irritability, mood swings as a result of the traumatic event. It can be anxiety and fear. That's a major one. A lot of times traumatic events happen and people live lives full of fear because of what happened, because of what they experienced, and fearful to make certain decisions, fearful to get into certain relationships. Then also, obviously, we have feelings of sadness or hopelessness, feeling disconnected or numb, not able to make significant connections with people. So, those are just a few of the emotional and psychological symptoms. Then we have physical symptoms. So, when it comes to experiencing trauma, a lot of times the impact can manifest physically with insomnia or nightmares. So, a person can be so severely traumatized to where they dream about it. And not even probably just the specific event. Sometimes it can be the specific event. Sometimes it could just simply be nightmares, period. Or some people just have trouble sleeping. They just can't get to sleep because of the intrusive thoughts and the reoccurring thoughts of what happened to them. So it makes it really hard for individuals to sleep. Extreme fatigue, just tired. So this is beyond being tired. It's just fatigue, not being able to get rest. And you may sleep. You may even have what you consider to be a good night's rest, right? But you wake up and you still are extremely tired in your body. Another one is a racing heartbeat, which goes along with anxiety and fear. You also can experience aches and pains and muscle tension. All righty. So now we are at the point of really looking at the trauma impact on the child. And this is where we're going to really look at what ACEs are. And remember, we said early on that it is adverse childhood experiences. So, although trauma can occur at any age, it has a debilitating long term effects on children's developing brains, often referred to as adverse childhood experiences. And exposure to these experiences are common across all sectors of society. It's very common, and you'll find that at least each person has had at least one ACE in their lifetime. And we'll be able to take a look at what the different traumatic events that fall under ACEs. And as a quick tip, ACEs are linked to chronic health problems, mental illness, and substance use problems in adulthood. And that's important for us to know today as we journey over into what trauma impact looks like on the adult. All right, so this is a breakdown of ACEs. And so the criteria for ACEs is any potentially traumatic event that occurs under the age of 18. So it says 0 to 17 years old. And it falls under three different categories. You have abuse, which can be physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, neglect, physical or emotional neglect, or even household dysfunction. And we'll take a look at what some of those things are. So, for example, experiencing violence, abuse, or neglect, witnessing violence in your home or in your community, or even having a family member attempt or die by suicide. All of these constitute as traumatic events for a child under the age of 18. So, also included are aspects of the child's environment that can undermine their sense of safety, stability, and bonding, such as growing up in a household where there are substance abuse problems, mental health problems, instability due to parental separation, and the separation can be child protective service involvement. The separation can be maybe a parent went to prison. All of these things constitute traumatic events and are defined as adverse childhood experiences. And so, our tip for this slide is children growing up with toxic stress may have difficulty forming healthy and stable relationships. And this is major for children because we already learned that children's brains are still developing. So when it comes to them experiencing traumatic events, it makes it really, really hard for them to navigate throughout their lifetime. I didn't say impossible. I said hard, because we're going to get into some of the things that can be helpful, once a child has experienced an ACE. But it just shows us that as children experience this at a very young age, it really affects them over the lifespan. So I want us to take a look at a video, and I'm only going to play about 2 minutes of it, but it's really going to give life to what ACEs is and what it looks like. I hope you guys can still see it. Really, really good video that speaks to the impact of trauma on children and the household. All right. So I hear the audio, but I don't see the picture. Oh, there we go.
My parents don't understand. All the drinking and fighting is upstairs. I'd like a cuddle. Perhaps a bedtime story. But mostly, I'd like them to stop shouting at me. And sometimes they hit me. Feeling scared if they do, and not feeling left unwanted will change me for the rest of my life. Getting a half drunk was at school. From under alcohol, and I get a trouble with the police. Also brings me memories of all my times, serious was an education, and I see what they shouted. Noticing is full of shocking experiences, Olivia says. Within reason, this means the theory conflicts very well. They teach children critical journalism is crucial, even if it's happens. I always bear hatred and hands. After the amazing class, the subject is good at the teachers and the real affairs. It gets used to that young language school. Notice that things are shared in a subway. And real experience was with the friends. Making it all the cancer diseases for kids. It is very interesting.
I drink and smoke. They say about control,
Where's my? There we go. All righty. I hope that that video really helped to shed light on not only just what ACEs is, but also how it literally looks for a child to be exposed to so much trauma, specifically in the home, and how it can affect them. Physically, talked about the development of their brain and not being able to regulate their emotions. So that's why a lot of times, people say about children, oh, he's just acting out or what have you, when in reality, is no, they've been through traumatic experiences to where they have not learned, number one, how to cope or process with it. So a lot of times it manifests in various behaviors, such as the little boy in the video said, I'm just angry. A lot of times it manifests like that. And so I want us to take a look at the ACEs quiz, because if you all remember, I said that really for each adult, each of us, in most cases, and I understand not all, in most cases, we can say we've experienced at least one ACE in our lifetime. And so the research suggests that if you have 4 or more, it really speaks to the long-term effects and complications, such as health complications or addictive behaviors and different things like that. So let's look at this. And I want you to score yourselves. Give yourself a 1 for each one that you can answer yes to. And I'm going to go ahead and answer on the screen. So number 1, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often swear at you, insult you, put you down, or humiliate you, or act in a way that made you afraid that you might be physically hurt? So if it's yes, give yourself a 1. If it's no, let's keep going. Number 2, did a parent or other adult in the household often or very often push, grab, slap, or throw something at you, or ever hit you so hard that you had marks or were injured? If it's yes, give yourself another 1. If it's no, let's keep going. Number 3, did an adult or person at least 5 years older than you ever touch or fondle you, or have you touch their body in a sexual way, or attempt or actually have oral, anal, or vaginal intercourse with you? Go ahead and answer as appropriate. Number 4, did you often or very often feel that no one in your family loved you or thought you were important or special, or your family didn't look out for each other, feel close to each other, or support each other? If it's yes, give yourself another 1. If it's no, let's keep going. Number 5, did you often or very often feel that you didn't have enough to eat? You had to wear dirty clothes and had no one protect you, or your parents were too drunk or high to take care of you or take you to the doctor if you needed it? So we're looking at the traumatic events that happen in childhood under the age of 18 that defines as an ACE. Were your parents ever separated or divorced? Yes or no? Was your mother or stepmother often or very often pushed, grabbed, slapped, or had something thrown at her? Or sometimes, often, or very often kicked, bitten, hit with a fist, or hit with something hard? Or ever repeatedly hit over at least a few minutes or threatened with a gun or a knife? So that's speaking to the physical violence. Did you live with anyone who was a problem drinker or alcoholic or used street drugs? Was a household member depressed or mentally ill, or did a household member attempt suicide? Did a household member go to prison? Yes or no? So here you'll just see me finishing, and here I scored a 3 out of 10 for my ACEs score. And so this is saying that these particular traumatic events happened that I experienced before the age of 18. And again, like we said, if you have 4 or more, that speaks to the research long-term effects. But again, this is all data that has been collected because we know with the appropriate intervention and social support, we can always heal through, process through, and cope with without there being long-term adverse effects. Let's keep going. So now that we've looked at the child that has been impacted by the trauma, let's look at that same child that has now become an adult, that same child who had scored on the ACEs, who is now an adult living with a history of trauma. So childhood trauma chips away at a child's stability and sense of self, undermining self-worth and often staying with the child into adulthood. This trauma can also impact a person into adulthood as they experience feelings of shame. Didn't mean to leave there. All right. Feelings of shame and guilt, feeling disconnected and unable to relate to other people, having trouble controlling their emotions, and a heightened anxiety and depression, and anger. So the tip for this particular slide is about 61% of adults surveyed across 25 states reported that they had experienced at least one type of ACE and nearly 1 in 6 reported that they had experienced 4 or more types of ACEs. Let's keep going. Traumatic experiences in childhood can contribute to a multitude of personal, emotional, psychological, and behavioral issues that manifest in adulthood. And these can include, but certainly are not limited to, depression, anxiety disorder, one we've all heard and know about, post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD, substance abuse. These are all things or lifestyles that suggest that because a child experienced an ACE, oftentimes these are the effects and the impact that manifests into adulthood. Marital difficulties, sexual issues, difficulty trusting other people for the obvious reasons. One person may experience multiple traumatic experiences in childhood, but emerges as a healthy and well adjusted adult. On the other hand, trauma can seriously damage another person, even if the experience is mild in comparison. Trauma is subjective. If someone believes he is in danger, the situation is traumatic. So that's going all the way back to the beginning of our presentation that says stress and trauma is all about perception. What may be traumatic for me may not be traumatic for you. It's all about how it affects us and our sense of danger, our sense of protection. And so this tip is basically saying that everybody is different. Some are able to adjust well into adulthood after experiencing ACEs, but other people, maybe not so much. So I wanted us to take a look at this scale, and let's look at the trauma checklist for adults. So just before, we looked at the ACEs questionnaire to really try to go back into our childhood and remember some of the things that may have occurred for us that were traumatic. So now that we're in the adulthood phase, we want to look at the trauma checklist for adults. And we're not going to go through all of this, and I'm willing to put all of these links into the chat box, or even send to Monique if we can send it out to the group, whichever is convenient. But some of these tools are just helpful for awareness or for sharing with other people. So just a few of the questions is below is a list of traumatic events or situations. When you're using a scale, you want to be able to mark yes if you've experienced it or witnessed the following events, or you mark no if you have not had that experience. So some of them are a serious accident, fire, or explosion. Another is a non-sexual assault by someone you know, physically attacked or injured, or a non-sexual assault by a stranger. Another one is a sexual assault by a family member or someone you know. Sexual contact before you were age 18 with someone who was 5 or more years older than you. So again, this checklist is very similar to ACEs. The only difference is with ACEs, we were looking at specifically within childhood under the age of 18. The trauma checklist can speak to traumatic events that we may have experienced in our adulthood that didn't happen in childhood. Okay, so here it lists several other traumatic events. It talks about physical injury, sexual abuse, so many different things that will constitute as traumatic events for each of us. And then we're able to score it at the end. Once we go through this particular checklist of questions, you're able to score it and really just see how things have manifested for you as an adult. So I'm going to go back to the slideshow. All righty. So one of the major things that has really intrigued me as it relates to experiencing traumatic events, whether it's in childhood, whether it's traumatic experiences that we've had as adults, it really shapes our adult attachment style. And attachment theory speaks to when we were children, our parents did or did not do something that impacts how we show up in our adult relationships. The theory suggests that however our parents were able to care for us, to meet our needs or not, shows up in how well we're able to be in relationships with other adults, especially romantic relationships. So I want to go through the 3 types of adult attachment styles. One is the dismissive avoidant attachment. This attachment style suggests that when we were children, we were rejected as a child. Maybe, the parent was so busy, often rejected us, or the caregiver simply ignored us as a child, and rejected our needs, wasn't attentive to our needs, and certainly didn't meet our needs for whatever the reason. And so now, when we became adults, we choose to be ultra independent in our relationships, and that's there as a protective factor, because we want to protect ourselves from being rejected again. So if we constantly got that message as children from our parents or our caregivers that our needs don't matter, and they were ignored and they were rejected, when we get into these relationships as adults, we're super independent. You ever hear somebody saying this is not a bad thing at all? I probably have said it at some point in my life, whether I was aware of the attachment styles or not, that I don't need anybody. I don't need anybody, but yet we're in relationships with people. And we know that relationships, people desire them to be reciprocal. But if you're independent and you don't need anybody, it hinders the relationship to a certain degree. And so the dismissive avoidant attachment says that our needs and we were rejected as children. And so now we show up as independent in our adult relationships. The other attachment style is fearful avoidant attachment. And this is where a child experiences and is exposed to abuse and neglect. And so it is natural for some to fear intimacy and close relationships. So if a child is abused and neglected, it's going to be hard to be intimate in adult relationships. It's difficult to cultivate those close relationships because you're fearful of being close to somebody, because you've had experience where you were abused and you were neglected and it was painful. And so that fear creeps in that makes you not want to trust anybody, makes you be really disconnected from your partners, even though you really want to be connected. And the last one is anxious, preoccupied, attachment. And this says the adult in the adult relationships may seem clingy or needy and will often require repeated validation, in clingy. I've heard, my brothers or something say throughout the time of just their time of dating or whatever, like, she too clingy, or, and oftentimes we hear that and we simply only think about behavior. And true enough, the behavior is what we see first, but you don't know the internal experience that led that person to be so clingy and so needy. It suggests that they didn't get something as a child, their needs weren't met. And so this type of attachment style suggests that they will never entirely feel secure, stemming from a childhood who had parents who were not consistent in the emotional security that they provided to that child. And so loving the child and then rejecting them repeatedly causes the child to continuously question their place and require ongoing validation. So that's just a child that has parents where one minute they are, affectionate and close, and the next minute they're pushing them back because maybe they're busy or they don't want to be in that space or whatever it is. And I'm just putting language or a narrative around it. But ultimately, when a child experiences that, they want that validation because they didn't get it at some point in their childhood. So these are the adult attachment styles. Now let's look at, so we've gone from the child impacted by trauma, to that same child growing up as an adult, living with a history of trauma, to now that adult who has now become a parent, but has a history of trauma. And I put the courage of parenting with a history of trauma. Trauma is an experience that we cannot be blamed for. A lot of what has happened to adults and what has happened to children certainly was not their fault. But a lot of times it was internalized that way. So it makes it really hard, as we already talked about, to show up in relationships. And in this context, showing up in the parental role. So it's tempting when you have had a difficult childhood to want to give your children the childhood you didn't have. Has anybody ever heard that? Where people went through so much as a child, and now that they've become a parent, they say, man, I just don't want my child to go through what I went through. True enough, true enough. But the most important thing you can do is give your child what he or she needs. So being able to shift that lens to not necessarily always offer what you didn't have, whether it's tangible or intangible, but make sure that you're very attentive to what they need. And children are sometimes they're able to articulate it and sometimes they're not, depending on the age, obviously, but really being attentive to what their needs are and responding to those needs. And each of your children will need different things, different parenting than you needed, or even different than their other siblings. If you have multiple children, one child may need one thing, the other child may need something completely different. So parenting with a trauma history is one of the bravest things that people can do, and it is invisible. And that speaks to, as a parent, when you show up day after day, striving to be the best parent that you can be, despite the triggers that come up because of your traumatic experiences, despite that some days it's difficult to cope with those traumatic experiences, but yet you have to show up for these children. And that's a brave thing to do. That's a brave thing to do. And just really owning that I'm not my experience. And I'm striving each day to be present with my children. A lot of times people from the outside looking in, they don't see your internal struggle. They see your behaviors. So say, for instance, you have a bad day, whatever that may look like. Maybe you were triggered and somebody saw the behavior, but they don't know the internal experience that you've had to live with, even while parenting. So it's really important to lift that up. So I wanted to share something with you all, just really talking about the parental role, but going back, and I know your children may be different ages, but really looking at the perinatal period. And this is the period from pregnancy, from the moment you know you're pregnant to 2 years postpartum. So that's the perinatal period. And so this period is critical for parents with a history of childhood maltreatment. This is the period where parents begin to experience triggering of trauma responses during the perinatal care or caring for their distressed infant. The long-lasting relational effects may impede the capacity of parents to nurture their children and lead to intergenerational cycles of trauma. Conversely, the perinatal period offers a unique life course opportunity for parental healing and prevention of child maltreatment. And this is just to say that this is a really critical time for a lot of parents, especially we all know about postpartum depression and all of this. But this suggests that from the moment you know you're pregnant to 2 years postpartum, there's going to be so much happening, so much coming up for you. Not just learning how to be a parent or tending to an infant, but also learning to manage your own triggers, your own trauma responses that are happening during that period. And it's difficult. It's difficult. And then you have to be able to care for an infant that may be going through distress as well. But it also lifts up the fact that it's also an opportunity for parental healing and prevention of child maltreatment. And what that speaks to is, I don't know if you all have ever heard someone say, well, my baby saved my life. My child saved my life. Speaking to the fact that now that they're a parent, they have so much to live for, or it has created a platform for healing. Maybe they begin to see the world differently or even see themselves differently, that helps to equip them to heal. I've seen it happen in both sides, but this is a very critical period. Your children may not understand you, but they will learn from you. That's a fact. We know that whether spoken or unspoken, children literally watch everything that their parents do, even when parents think they are not listening. And as they grow and mature, it is possible that they'll develop an appreciation for all that you have done and all that you did not do, based on your own history of trauma and life experiences. And I'll share really quickly as we continue to go forward, and just really being very cognizant of the time, just looking at the tip of saying that children will grow an appreciation for your parental role despite your trauma you've been through. My mom, I too, as you all saw from the ACEs quiz, I've experienced adverse childhood experiences, probably like most of you. And as you're going through that, you don't always see, as they say, the light at the end of the tunnel. But as the tip said, as you grow and mature, you're able to look back and really be like, well, my mom, she did the best that she could, right? Given the circumstance. And the circumstances for my mom was, she was addicted to heroin, right? She didn't raise me after the age of 5. I was blessed to be able to go with my great grandmother. But the point I'm making is children do grow and mature into a place of acceptance and appreciation of who you are as a parent and all that you tried to do for them and all that you could not do. So real quick, trauma can affect parenting. We've already talked about that. It could definitely affect the attachment you have between you and your child. And just to read a few, it can compromise parents' ability to make appropriate judgments about their own and their child's safety, and to appropriately appraise danger. So in some cases, parents may be overprotective, and in others, they may not be able to recognize situations that can be dangerous for their child. So it's all about a trauma lens. A lot of times we're looking at situations and decision making based on our traumatic experiences. Hence why a parent may be very overprotective. Perhaps that parent was sexually abused as a child. So now they're overprotective of their children. You're not going to spend a night out nowhere. You're not, be home at a certain time. Whatever it may be, it shows up. Also, it can lead to poor self-esteem and the development of maladaptive coping strategies, such as substance abuse or abusive intimate relationships that parents maintain because of a real or perceived lack of alternatives. So again, while we're talking about trauma and stress, we're talking about awareness, but we're also talking about how you can cope with these experiences. But individuals who don't have the awareness, they don't have the coping techniques, will oftentimes adopt unhealthy coping strategies and techniques that are harmful to them as well, such as substance abuse and domestic violence in relationships. So after we've looked at all of these traumatic events, after we've even searched ourselves with looking at some of these slides and different things coming up for us based on what we've experienced and other people that we may know, we want to really lift up that there are some healthy ways to cope with stress and traumatic events. Stress is a reaction to a situation, and this is just recapping, where a person feels threatened or anxious. Learning healthy ways to cope and getting the right care and support can significantly help to reduce stressful feelings and symptoms. And just to name a few, the number one thing, as best as you can, take care of yourself, whatever that means, whatever that looks like for you. Eat healthy, exercise if you can, get plenty of sleep if you can. We know that sometimes sleep is hard to come by. Give yourself a break when you know you've worked so hard, or even when you begin to feel stressed out. And then talk to other people. A lot of times we harbor so many emotional feelings and all of these different things that come up for us, and we don't always feel comfortable enough talking to other people. But we found that sharing your problems and your experiences with other people can actually help. And even if it isn't somebody you know, it can be a counselor, a doctor, or someone you do know, a parent, another parent that may be experiencing similar things, or a friend. Avoid using drugs and alcohol. And this is not to say altogether, we're not talking about recreational use where you have an occasional drink or anything like that. But it's saying to avoid drugs and alcohol as a coping strategy. Because when we indulge in those things, they may seem to help for that moment. As I've heard some people say, it numbs the pain or it just helps me not to think about it. But it also can create additional problems that we certainly do not need. And it can increase the stress that we are already feeling. And then recognize when you need more help. And I have a slide at the end that's going to talk about when to seek outside help or additional support. But recognize when you need more help. So if problems continue or you begin to think about suicide, or talk to a psychologist or a social worker or a therapist, anybody to help you process what's happening for you. And now we want to look at how we can help children cope. So, talking to your children about stressful events can help put frightening information into a more balanced setting. Monitor what children see and hear as best as we can about stressful events happening in their lives. So, here are a few suggestions. Maintain a normal routine. And I'll throw in as best as possible because I know, as parents, you have multiple obligations and demands. But help them wake up and go to sleep around the same time. Help your children to eat meals at regular times, and so that they begin to feel a sense of stability. This helps them cope tremendously. And many of you may already be doing this. Also, talk, listen, and encourage them to express themselves. Listen to your child's thoughts and feelings, and even share some of yours. You'll be surprised. And again, I'm speaking to parents, so I know you guys already have experience with your children and doing some of these things. So some of these things are simply reminders, but sometimes when you're transparent with your children, especially about situations that you think may not be good for them, or you're wondering if they're age appropriate for them. But however it is that you're led to share some of these things, it can really increase the closeness that you have with your child, because they begin to see, oh, mom, she went through that, or she's human too, or, but it can help to bring you closer. Watch and listen. Always pay attention to your kids. These kids are always into things. Things are happening for them internally, and they won't always speak it. So it's very important to be alert for any change in behavior. So if you notice your child they're usually almost always in the living room playing games and laughing and maybe talking with the family or talking to somebody they're talking to on the headset. The kids play these video games with these headsets, and you don't know who they talking to on the other end. But the point is, if they're usually doing that, and then all of a sudden you see them come home from school and they go straight in their room and they're not saying much, or they're not showing up for dinner because they're not hungry, these are all things to be mindful of and pay attention to, because any changes in behavior may be signs that your child is having trouble and may need additional support. And lastly, I'll say connect with others. Talk to other parents and your child's teachers about ways to help your child cope. A lot of times these teachers see behaviors that we don't see in the home for whatever reason. Sometimes these teachers see much more than we see, or they see a different side of our children. So it's important to check in with that teacher every now and then, not just about their grades, but how is Arnaz doing? Whatever it may be. They oftentimes can share insight that may be news to you. All right, when to know when to seek professional help. So, recovering from trauma takes time. Everyone heals at their own pace, and it's so important to lay that out. Everybody is different. If I'm able to heal through and process and get through something, and maybe it only took me 3 months, now I'm just hypothetically speaking. But for you, it may take much longer than that. Embrace your journey, embrace your process so that you can heal at your own pace without any expectations from anybody else. But if months have passed and your symptoms remain the same and you don't see them to be letting up, that may be an indicator that it's time to seek professional help from a trauma expert or even just a therapist, a psychologist. People need to understand how rare or frequent your examples are. So here are a few very direct examples. You're having trouble functioning at home, at home or at work. Significant impairment of functioning. You're not even showing up the same. Maybe there's no productivity. You're not even doing your work because you're so preoccupied with the trauma symptoms that manifest, whether it's internally. Remember, we talked about internal symptoms versus physical symptoms. Or you're suffering from severe fear, anxiety, or depression. It's major. Or you're experiencing terrifying memories or nightmares or flashbacks. Now, nightmares and flashbacks, those are definitely trauma symptoms. But if it's extremely terrifying and it's just getting to the point where you're not getting any rest because you're having all of these nightmares and flashbacks, it might be time to seek additional professional help. Or you find that you're unable to form close, satisfying relationships. And maybe you were able to do that before. But now you just don't seem any sense of closeness. You don't even want to be close. You don't feel satisfied in your relationship. It may be time to talk to somebody. All righty, and we are done. I put just a few resources here. And again, if there's any way that I can send anything out after the presentation, I would love to do so. And I hope that something was said today. How do I get out of here? I think I'm okay. There we go. I hope something was said today that was enlightening, and something you learned or something that was just helpful. And thank you guys. Thank you for allowing me to be a part, and thank you, Monique.
All right. And I had just one little question for you. One of the adults said that I'm in an abusive relationship and I don't know what to do.
So one of the things, especially, and thank you so much for raising that question, whomever sent it. But one of the things we were talking about in the presentation today is really monitoring what's happening for you. So you're in that abusive relationship. You don't know what to do. You know for a fact that it's causing an impairment of functioning for you. You know that the symptoms of even experiencing that is so hard. It may be time to get some other type of intervention, whether it's a trusted individual that you can share and be transparent with and say, hey, this is happening. And they could be able to help to facilitate you to get resources or even get away from that particular person. Some people may not want to leave the relationship, but perhaps they want to process. I'm not sure. Everybody is different. But being able to seek additional support is going to be paramount.
Okay. And the other question that was asked is my partner calls me names and I don't know what to do.
Okay. So with the calling of names, my question would be, have you ever brought it up? Have you ever talked about it? Have you ever expressed that, okay, you calling me names affects me in this way? Being very direct about it and being able to lift that up so that, number one, that person is aware. I mean, and you may be thinking, well, they're calling me names. Of course, they're aware, but being able to connect your experience with that to them. Because if you're able to lift that up and nothing changes, and it's still impacting you in a major way, then it may be time to kind of rethink, reevaluate what's happening in the relationship. Or maybe you guys, if it's a marriage, you may need, couples counseling or what have you to process that.
Okay. And I don't know how to move past my past trauma.
Okay. With trauma, as we just went through so much of just the reality of trauma, and moving past it can be very difficult. And sometimes we need a facilitator, if you will, in helping to process, number one, just simply what happened. So many people experience trauma and have not been able to put words to it because it's been so painful, and you don't want to relive it in that way. And we all know that when you begin to talk about these traumatic experiences, it brings up a lot of that stuff. Even if it was 5-10 years ago, whatever it may be, it brings it up as though it's currently happening or just happened. But that's the first start. We have to be able to name it for exactly what it was. If it was sexual abuse, physical abuse, be able to name it and then be able to begin to process it. And maybe it's with somebody else. Again, professional facilitation.
Okay, now what if my trauma came from family? You know how sometimes people say, like, I feel like it's easier for you to leave trauma when it's like a friend. But like when it's somebody who's a part of your family, whether it's a mother, a father, a brother, whomever, I feel like it might not be as easy. Or like if it's your kid's mother or your kid's father, it might not be as easy just to leave than it would be a friend.
Absolutely. Very difficult. Because you know how they say you don't choose your family? You don't choose your family. They're not going nowhere. And sometimes, a lot of times when you look at them, it's re-experiencing the trauma.
Mhm.
Maybe they promise I'll never do it again or whatever it was, but you still have to leave them, and you still have to re-experience as much as we don't want to. We don't want to go back. Like you said, this is a family member. So, I mean, it's going to be hard. And I'm going to keep going back to professional help because it's going to be hard to do it on your own. If you can do it on your own and simply talk to that individual, then perhaps the process of healing may have started a long time ago. We know, with these things. And it's important even now. That's why I love this platform of there's still stigma around mental health treatment, around counseling. I don't want to go down there and tell them people all my business or
Business.
and that's real too, but we just have to be able to be honest and say that I no longer want to live contained, bound to my traumatic experience. And I've reached a point where I'm going to get some help with this because I can't do it by myself.
That was good. That was good. And the last question I have is, I don't feel like I can leave a situation and I've been hurt. And I think it's toxic.
You don't think you can leave? Well, and this is like a romantic relationship or just a general platonic friendship or
I mean, they didn't say, but I'm assuming it would be maybe what if it's a relationship that has kids involved?
right. Now that's kind of hard because especially if like you said in the question, they don't want to leave, so that suggests that they're still in a relationship. I mean, in that situation, I mean, it depends on how toxic it is. And the reason why I say that is because some people can experience some really toxic, situations, but say it happens every now and then. It's not something that's every day or they're constantly up against it. So I would say it would depend largely on the relationship, how often it's happening. Is it so toxic to where you guys can't sit down and have a relationship? Or I mean, Is it so toxic that you guys can't and go and get that facilitation support? Is it so toxic to where you have a sense of safety? What type of, toxic is it? Because that helps us to navigate, okay, what's my next move in the situation?
Okay, that was good. That was good. Because sometimes we I feel like because of COVID, it has intensified a lot of things that have been going on, whether it's in family and just relationships in general. And so, because we've been sheltering in place, it's like where we might have been able to do, X, Y, and Z, we don't necessarily feel like we have options. And two, because there's so much stigma around mental health, and people think, oh well, when you say mental health, people might say, oh well, you crazy, or a lot of different things. When mental health, like, no matter how we shape it, we have to take care of our mental health.
Absolutely.
We can't just ignore the mental health. And even though there have been stigmas in communities, we still have to be aware that we all have mental health that needs to be taken care of and addressed. And just having some tools and resources.
Absolutely. That's why, I'm grateful for the fact that a lot of entities have lifted up trauma-informed care approach, because that I feel speaks to our community that is not going to go get treatment somewhere, not going to show up for therapy, but you have some trained people. It's a teacher, even people in the hospital setting, they've learned and they've trained how to be present with these individuals that cross their path. And you never know, something may be said or been done, even within 5 minutes, that can help to shift that person's perception of what happened to them and what can happen for them. Look into the future of, I don't have to stay confined to what has happened to me. So
yeah. And trauma looks different.
Yes,
so I don't, everybody might have a different idea. When you think of trauma, you might think of like domestic violence or whatever. But I think one part that needs to be like emphasized is like, even though you're not in the situation, doesn't mean that your trauma just disappears.
Absolutely.
It's still like a process of what you have to work through to be able to work through that trauma.
Absolutely.
And I feel like that's a misconception of trauma, because you could have been homeless for years. And just because you get a home doesn't mean that the trauma of homelessness leaves. Just because you leave an abusive relationship doesn't mean that the trauma from that abuse leaves. It just means that it's no longer like something that's like in your immediate, but it's still something that you have to work through and process, because when you have trauma and it's unresolved, you don't show up as the person that you were created to show up as. You show up as a variation because of the trauma.
So true. So true. And you lifted that up so well, but that goes back to looking at the categories of trauma. Even if it only happened one time, it makes it no less than of an impact. It's acute trauma. It happened one and done, but guess what? I'm still impacted by it. So it doesn't make my traumatic experience or my symptoms that show up every day any less than anybody, that unfortunately may have experienced trauma over a period of time.
Yeah, that's good.
It just is no less of an impact.
That's good. That's good. Well, Alexis, I appreciate you today. This has been so informative. It's been so informative. Today's word of the day will be impact. Impact. So next week, if you tune into our show or tune into our broadcast, and when we ask the question at the beginning, what was the word of the day? If you say impact, there will be a little something for you for responding. We thank you so much for your time. It's good to see you.
Good to see you too.
I will talk to you later.
All right. Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.